Good morning. My name is David Furlow, and I am here today as chair of the American Bar Association's Media, Defamation, and Privacy Law Committee to present you a distinguished panel who will discuss issues relating to the ethical issues in the use of animals. And we do have two very distinguished speakers here today. Professor Margaret Foster Riley will be appearing second, and first we will have Dr. Bernard E. Rollin. Dr. Bernard Rollin has helped shape the study of the ethics of animals while working as the University Distinguished Professor of Philosophy, Biomedical Sciences, Animal Sciences, and University Bioethicist at Colorado State University for many years, where he has written some of the most important books available on the ethics of animals. As an overview of what both of these two speakers are going to be discussing, and specifically beginning with Dr. Rollin's analysis, I want to just bring to your attention what is known as Gresham's law of money. And that is the concept that bad money drives out good money. And it's an American concept that goes all the way back to the 1600s into New Netherland. That is the place that's now New Amsterdam, when the Dutch quickly realized that bad, cheaply made wampum, the shell beads that served as money, would drive out good wampum, that is, nicely, artfully done beads, because you could get the other stuff cheaper and sell it just as well as the finely made wampum beads. And so laws were instituted at the beginning of America prohibiting the substitution of cheap bad wampum for good wampum because of the concept that bad money drives out good. And we see Gresham's law of money, as was announced, applied over to media throughout the country. How many people here, in terms of talking with friends and relatives, hear concepts of bioethics and the genetic engineering of animals discussed in a reasoned analysis of the facts of Dolly the cloned sheep? Probably very few. Most of our friends and relatives, when they are concerned about issues of bioengineering and ethics and genetics, get their background information from having seen The Boys from Brazil, that film about the genetic cloning of little Hitlers down in Brazil, or, better yet, Clone Wars, Star Wars 2. And so we have in the press a concept of Gresham's law of the sensationalistic, the emotional, and the visual driving out reason in terms of the public discussion. So too we see that in ethics. This is one of the topics that Dr. Rollin has brought to our attention, the danger that the sensationalistic in the discussion of animal ethics can often drive out the well-reasoned. Dr. Rollin.
Thank you. I'm not using slides because when you spend 40 years studying truth and beauty, I'm not sharing it with you in 40 minutes. The advent of biotechnology has provided society with what could become the most powerful technological tool ever possessed by humanity. The public response to biotechnology, however, particularly in Europe, has not been overwhelmingly positive, and a good many social and ethical issues must be addressed before it will be acceptable to society in general. Primarily because science has tended to distance itself from ethical issues, these issues have been defined for the public by others, sometimes in inaccurate ways. And I submit there are three sorts of issues regarding any biotechnology. The claim that it's intrinsically wrong, it's just wrong regardless of consequences, the claim that it's dangerous to society and or nature, and the claim that it is likely to produce a fair amount of suffering for animals. And I'll look at these in turn. In a book I did on genetic engineering that came out in '95, I articulated what I called, as Mr. Furlow said, the Gresham's law for ethics. Gresham's law asserts that bad money drives good money out of circulation. If people are faced with the option of paying a debt with either of two currencies of the same face value, they will inexorably pay the debt with the one that has the least intrinsic value, as in Germany post-World War I, when it took a barrel of Deutschmarks to buy a loaf of bread. If you owed money on your house, you didn't pay in gold. Same thing happens in ethics. In the absence of the relevant communities articulating the ethical issues, a vacuum is filled, and that vacuum is filled by opportunists, doomsayers, etc. We see this in every major social revolution, whether it's affirmative action, whether it's feminism, whether it's animal ethics, and then that distorts social understanding. And this, of course, has occurred with genetic engineering. Genetic engineering is playing God. Genetic engineering is against nature. Genetic engineering, these are all real quotes, by the way. Genetic engineering does not show proper respect for the gift of life. Genetic engineering breaches species barriers and violates species integrity. And once these become entrenched, they become impossible to dislodge. The major problem, and I have a book on this that just came out with Cambridge, is what I call scientific ideology. Going back to Newton, but really manifest in the 20th century, the scientific community has taken the position that it's not within their purview to address ethical issues. Out of a textbook of introductory biology widely used, Keaton and Gould, science cannot make value judgments. Sylvia Mader, science cannot make ethical judgments. Ethical judgments in this view fall within the purview of, at best, society in general, at worst, politicians. And I've called this the ideology of science or the common sense of science, which began by serving a laudable purpose, expunging from science concepts that were essentially unprovable, metaphysical, be they life force of the sort postulated by Bergson in late 19th century biology, or absolute space perpetrated by Newton and debunked by Einstein. The baby was thrown out with the bathwater. If science dealt only with observables and ethical judgments, as Wittgenstein said, you can take an inventory of all the facts in the universe, you don't find it a fact that killing is wrong, they become scientifically meaningless. And the result is, I wrote the federal laws that Dr. Kaufman referred to and defended them before Congress, and I was very hard-pressed to find any rational articulation defending the use of animals in research, particularly the unrestricted use of animals in research, because the scientific community simply didn't address this. The best example I've ever been able to come up with, quick and dirty, of this sort of position, James Weingarten, the head of NIH in 1989, was informally addressing some students at Michigan State, had his guard down, and was asked by these pre-med students, what are the ethical issues in genetic engineering? And he said, quote, new scientific innovations are always controversial, but, quote, genetic engineering should never be hindered by ethical considerations. He got into big trouble for that. And bear in mind, though, that this is revelatory. Granted, it was a slip, supposedly, and so forth, but still, he's the chief biomedical scientist of the United States. And, you know, there's something going on there. And of course, science is not value-free. When massive amounts of public money are funneled into AIDS research rather than into curing baldness, the subject matter of science is determined by social ethical values. When biomedical research is performed on rats rather than on unwanted children, who are actually a higher fidelity model for the rest of us, and the control of pain in these rats is socially mandated, the method of science is determined by societal values. And when the degree of statistical reliability demanded in science fluctuates, whether one is testing the efficacy of a new human drug versus a survey instrument versus an animal drug, one again sees the influence of ethics. Experimental design, acceptable sample sizes, acceptable confidence intervals will vary greatly across different types of research because of moral concerns, even when the same logical type of question is being asked. So the logic of science is modulated by ethical concerns. Genetic engineering is a classic example of where that community did not define the ethical issues, and that lacuna was filled by doomsayers. Playing God, that's one you hear a lot. Jeremy Rifkin has made much out of that. I'm not sure I know what that means, and I certainly don't see it as an ethical issue. If playing God by manipulating life is wrong, so too is damming rivers, eradicating smallpox, building cities, wearing clothes, maybe. I mean, if God had meant us to wear clothes, et cetera. And to be fair, there is a whole school of theologians who don't take this view, the so-called co-creation school, tending to be more liberal. You can dismiss, and these are actual quotes from this is the National Council of Churches, the gift of life from God in all of its forms and species should not be regarded solely as if it were a chemical product subject to genetic alteration. I don't see any argument. I don't see what's ethically problematic, and until they articulate that, and instead of just issuing portentous declarations, I don't know that we can take it seriously. Similarly, Rifkin's claim that genetic engineering desacralizes nature, violates species integrity, crosses species barriers. In actual fact, if you've had basic biology, you know that species are not fixed, immutable, rigid building blocks of nature that Aristotle and the Bible believe them to be. At best, they are momentary snapshots of an inherently dynamic process. And we've been participating in the evolution of species since we crawled out of the primeval slime. 70% of grasses and 40% of flowering plants were created through human artifice. And we've vastly and majorly modified large numbers of animals, not always in a good way. Look at the dog. There are over 400 genetic diseases of dogs perpetuated by traditional breeding and breed standards. You sometimes hear that genetic engineering is wrong because of the, quote, mixing of human and animal traits. Presumably this means the insertion of human genetic material into animals or the insertion of animal genetic material into humans. The former has occurred, the latter has yet to occur. What is wrong with such an admixture? We've certainly inserted animal parts in the human body to treat disease. Pig heart valves have been used for probably 30 years. Pig skin has been used. Suppose we found an animal containing a gene that prevented cancer. Sharks, allegedly, are tumor-free. Suppose that this gene produced no untoward effect in humans, only conferred immunity against neoplasia. Why would such gene transfer be in itself wrong? Similarly, if the case were reversed. The only problem that I see with putting a human gene into an animal is if it hurts the animal. And I'll give you an example of that shortly when we talk about the transgenic pig that was developed to be more efficient. Let me give you an example from personal experience of how bad ethics works in society. A couple of years before Dolly was announced by the people who made Dolly, I got a call from them, the Roslin Institute at home, on a Saturday, and they said, can you talk to, I knew the guy from conferences, and he said, I respect your views on these things. Could you give us a quick rundown on the ethical issues associated with cloning an animal? And I said, a line I've always wanted to use since I was a kid, it's your nickel, pal. So we actually talked for 2.5 hours, and I pointed out to him that there are 3 types of issues, as I mentioned at the beginning. Is there going to be animal suffering? He said, we can handle that. Is there danger to society? We can handle that, he said. I said, then address these issues that are pseudo-issues and make sure the public understands what is really going on and what the genuine issues are. And he said, what do you mean? I said, if you guys don't do that, somebody is going to say that it violates God's will. And what was extremely amusing about that, of course, is they didn't listen at all, and they dropped it like Athena from the head of Zeus on the general public. And Time Warner did a survey the first week that Dolly was announced. 3 out of 4 Americans, 75%, said it violates God's will. And then how do you reply to that? You email God? His box is full. There are really genuine issues of risk associated with biotechnology in general, particularly genetic engineering. And one of the mistakes that the biotechnology community has made is use, quote, experts to address these risks. I think any discussion of risk and benefit has to be undertaken by the community in general, or at least its representatives. To be honest, and I am appointed in 2 science departments, done research myself, et cetera, et cetera. the public does not trust experts. It's inherent in American culture, going back to its formation, not to trust so-called experts. We have the best experts that money can buy, has been said to me. We've lived through too many Chernobyls, too many Challengers, too many Killer Bee escapes, too many cavalier attitudes about dangers. I myself have witnessed dozens of scientists mouth pipetting TB, you know, which is not a risk the ordinary person would accept. I mean, and the scientific community is willing to weigh certain benefits over certain risks, but the general community is not in terms of the advancement of knowledge. Failure to involve the public in such adjudication results in rejection of genetic engineering. BST is the classic example. Campbell's genetically engineered tomato is another classic example. Have you all read Jurassic Park? That's basically the point, is not trusting. I mean, there are some really good philosophical passages in there. What are the potential dangers? Well, genetic engineering is evolution in the fast lane. When you do traditional breeding, you get an enforced waiting period between litters or generations or whatever it is. You can propagate through genetic engineering very, very quickly. And the result is there may well be a tendency to miss, although there's been a tendency in traditional breeding also, to miss some of the untoward consequences. The bull that has sired back in the 50s, most of the Holstein lines, turned out to have a blood disease that wasn't detected for a few generations. In traditional breeding, a good example of this of this phenomenon is called pleiotropy. One gene and its product control or code for more than a single trait. And there have been many examples of people doing things, for example, inserting a gene by traditional breeding into corn so that it controlled male sterility and it saved the labor of detasseling the corn. It turned out that gene was also responsible for increased susceptibility to southern corn blight, and the year that was adopted, the crop was completely devastated. So what we have is what philosophers call an a fortiori situation. If we have unanticipated consequences, watching traditional breeding carefully over a slow frame, imagine how much it could happen with genetic engineering. The second type of danger can be illustrated by reference to food animals. Here, the isolated characteristic being engineered into the organism may have unsuspected harmful consequences to humans who consume that animal. The deep issue is that you can genetically engineer traits in animals without a full understanding of the physiological mechanisms involved in phenotypic expression of those traits, and the result can be disaster. And the ideal then is to really be cautious in one's engineering until one has at least a reasonable grasp of the physiological and metabolic mechanisms affected by the insertion of a given gene. A third kind of risk is one of is amplifying a problem that already characterizes modern agriculture, the narrowing of a gene pool, the tendency towards genetic uniformity, what they call monoculture, the emergence of harmful recessives, the loss of hybrid vigor, and the greatest issue is the susceptibility of a monoculture to pathogenic destruction, which we've already seen in crops and in egg layers who are genetically homogeneous. And you can all understand how this would occur. I don't need to get into it. A fourth set of risks arise from the fact that in certain cases, when one changes animals, one can alter the pathogens to which they are host, making them dangerous. This can occur in two ways. Suppose you genetically engineer for resistance to a given pathogen in an animal. You could unwittingly create an environment in that animal favorable to a natural mutation of that pathogenic microbe to which the modified animal would not be resistant. The new organisms could then be infectious to other animals or to humans. Something similar to the indiscriminate use of antibiotics in animal feeds. Nobody intended to create antibiotic-resistant microorganisms, but it was a reasonable projection that was in fact warned of in the 1948 issue of Journal of Microbiology. And so we're now in a race between the drug companies and the pathogens. Secondly, you can genetically engineer an animal by changing the microenvironment in which they live. I mean, suppose you change ruminal temperature to make the rumen more efficient. That could create a whole different ecological niche for potentially harmful pathogens. The more precipitous change, the more difficult it is to estimate the effects of the pathogens. I'm not saying this has in fact occurred, but I did bounce it off a good friend of mine who's a division chief at CDC, and he said it's absolutely possible. Another risk is ecological. Less of a risk with strictly confined animals, but I can state categorically that strict confinement is not so strict. There has never been a biocontainment facility that mice couldn't get out of and wild mice couldn't get into. We had this at CSU, leading to an epidemic of lymphochoriomeningitis virus. It's particularly an issue with fish because of their rapid breeding. We don't understand animals that we know historically well, what happens when we release them into a new environment. The mongoose in Hawaii, the rabbit in Australia, the zebra mussel, the killer bees that were accidentally released, snails and mussels in our waterways and so forth. Certainly with a newly engineered creature, this is even more likely. There are also environmental risks. What effect would biotechnology have on environmental degradation? We don't know. Could be good, could be bad. It has been argued by some of my colleagues that genetically engineering animals to adapt to indigenous conditions could halt such practices as slash and burn agriculture in South America that has led to desertification. On the other hand, it's equally plausible to suggest that such technology could augment plunder by foisting animals on all sorts of hitherto undisturbed areas with unimaginable consequences. Another set of risks is military. We don't have to talk about that. There was serious talk of genetically engineering the mosquitoes to be able to disseminate the AIDS virus. And I know military researchers, even before genetic engineering, did some things that are almost unimaginable. And finally, the patenting of genetically engineered animals poses socioeconomic risks, insofar as we're worried about the survival of small family farms, which we genuinely seem to be. Expensive transgenic animals acquisition in competition with large corporations who would inevitably use such things might do more to drive small farmers out of business. Interestingly enough, and this is a pivotal point in my talk, a friend of mine is named George Gaskell. He works at the London School of Economics. And he did a survey. The traditional wisdom of regulators indicates that people are aversive to genetic engineering because they are afraid of the risks. Frankenstein, that's what my book is called, the Frankenstein syndrome. And Gaskell actually tested this hypothesis and said there's, quote, a striking mismatch between the traditional concern of regulators with issues of risk and safety and that of the public, which centers on questions of moral acceptability. He surveyed 17,000 people in 18 European countries and asked them about 6 different aspects of biotechnology. Medicine production, such as production of insulin in bacteria, crop plant modification, food production, for example, to make foods higher in protein, golden rice, or have longer storage life, transgenic research animals, genetically modified for research, such as the doctor was talking about, such as the oncomouse, which is more prone to mammary tumors, and xenotransplantations, taking animal organs and rendering them immunologically compatible with human immune system for transplantation, as was studied for a while with pigs. These were all perceived as, well, what the public said unequivocally and almost uniformly to Gaskell was, if there's a lot of benefit, we're willing to take risk. That's not the issue. The issue is if we consider it morally unacceptable, and which of those things I listed did uniformly European society consider morally unacceptable? Creation of animal models, and I'll explain that to you at the end why. And secondly, a xenotransplantation. And that, I think, is bad ethics. People still believe that the heart is the locus of the soul. And a lot of Europeans said they wouldn't accept the pig heart even to save their life because they think it would make them swinish. I don't see a problem. I mean, we already deal with administrators. The key point that we can glean from Gaskell is the degree to which the scientific community's neglect of ethics has had an impact on the social acceptability of biotechnology. And, you know, I heard some positive points from you yesterday that the scientific community is beginning to engage this, but I would warrant that it's probably too little and in some ways too late. Now, bear in mind, by the way, that you could be a psychopath with no conscience if you were a genetic engineer and still worry about these risks. Why? Because they're prudential issues. If some pathogen were to be genetically released on the public, it would inexorably lead toward curtailment of that science, of funding for that science, as happened, in fact, with cloning. As soon as certain countries cut off money to that kind of study, and nothing bad happened when Dolly was cloned. So the important point, though, to bear in mind is society is worried more about ethics than about risk. Okay? The genuine ethical issue, non-prudential and non-Gresham, is the issue of animal suffering. What kind of modifications would be exerted on animals, and what effect would that have on their well-being? And we're living in a time where social concern for animal welfare has never been higher. I serve on the Pew Commission regarding confinement agriculture. I'm currently trying to broker an agreement between the Colorado ag community and the Humane Society of the United States in lieu of them coming in with a referendum that agriculture can't afford to fight. I'm well aware of the degree to which animal welfare, animal rights have seized public imagination. In agriculture, if you look at the genetic engineering of animals, genetic engineering as well as traditional breeding has largely been based on increasing efficiency and productivity. That's what industrial agriculture does, going back to the 30s. It had a univocal thrust towards efficiency and productivity, and now, of course, we're seeing the consequences of that in various arenas, epidemiologically, in terms of disease creation and dissemination from factory farms, water pollution, air pollution, ground pollution, et cetera, et cetera. Societal consequences of driving out. We lost 82% of our small pork producers since the 1980s, et cetera. And it's clear from the history of confinement agriculture, and again, I have an appointment in an animal science department. It's clear from the history of confinement agriculture that the univocal thrust for productivity and efficiency did not affect welfare if the welfare did not affect the productivity. You see, in fact, the definition of welfare in the CAST report of 1981, Council of Agricultural Science and Technology, was the animals are well off if they're productive. That's actually not as stupid as it sounds. It's true under traditional biblical pastoral husbandry agriculture, because the greatest sanction to the farmer if you didn't treat the animals well was they didn't produce. But we have technological sanders by which we can force square pegs into round holes. Antibiotics, vaccines, air handling systems, bacterins, etc. And because of this, we can create situations where the animal's welfare is negatively affected, but they still produce. I mean, obviously productivity is not a direct measure of welfare except under certain conditions. If we were raising people for food, we'd probably be best off putting them under the abysmal conditions that people live in the slums of Brazil, because you have nothing else to do but reproduce, number one. And number two, because there's no social safety net for your age, and so you have as many kids as you can, hoping that some of them will make it enough to care for you later. So predictably, the genetic engineering that was done on farm animals was done to increase efficiency and productivity. They attempted to increase the growth rate and efficiency of pigs and sheep by insertion of modified genes to control growth. While achieving that result, they have engendered significant suffering. Incidentally, they put the well-characterized human growth hormone gene into pigs per cell at Ohio State, if you're doubting me. I'll give you the reference. The desired results were to increase growth rate and efficiency and weight gain, reduce carcass fat, etc. Certain of these goals were achieved. Pigs' rate of gain was increased 15%, feed efficiency 18%, carcass fat was reduced to full 80%, but the unanticipated effects with significantly negative impact on the animal's well-being also occurred. Life-shortening pathogenic changes in pigs included kidney and liver problems, lethargy, lameness, uncoordinated gait, bulging eyes, thickening skin, gastric ulcers, severe synovitis, degenerative joint disease, heart disease of various kinds, nephritis, and pneumonia. Sexual behavior was anomalous. Females were anestrous and boars lacked libido. Other problems included tendency towards diabetes and compromised immune function. The sheep fared better for the first 6 months, but eventually also showed health problems. There are lessons to be learned from these experiments. In the first place, similar experiments had been done earlier in mice, and mice did not show many of these side effects. So it's difficult to extrapolate in a linear way from species to species, even when you're attempting putatively the same thing. It is also impossible to affect one-to-one correspondence between gene transfer and the appearance of a desired phenotypic trait. The holy grail in animal science is the tenderness gene. And I've got bets with some of my buddies that there is no tenderness gene. Just like there's no intelligence gene, just like there's no violence gene. You know, that's, but engineers think one gene, one trait, you know? Genes can have multiple effects, and traits can be under the control of multiple genes. The relevance of this point to welfare is obvious and analogous to a point we made earlier. One should be extremely circumspect in one's engineering until you understand the physiological consequences of inserting a gene. Examples of that, they attempted in the 90s to genetically engineer mice to produce greater amounts of interleukin-4, an immune-related hormone, in order to study aspects of the immune system. This resulted in the animals experiencing osteoporosis and obviously had a negative effect on welfare. There was another case in the 80s. An unrelated gene was inserted into mice, and it produced legless animals and craniofacial malformations. I myself witnessed an attempt to put a double muscling gene into cattle, and the animal was fine when it was born, but within 6 weeks it couldn't stand up on its own and had to be euthanized. What it looked like to me, looking at the muscle tissue under the microscope and also not the microscope, was they had doubled the musculature without doubling the vasculature. So there was no blood supply sufficient to nourish that muscle tissue. Welfare issues arise both in genetically engineered agricultural animals for experiments and more drastically in potential commercial production. And the issues associated with mass production of suffering genetically engineered animals, to handle that, I proposed something I called the principle of conservation of welfare to guide agriculture. And I presented this at a whole meeting of genetic engineers, and there wasn't anybody in the audience who didn't agree with this, to their credit. And the principle states that genetically engineered animals should be no worse off than the parent stock would be if they were not so engineered, and ideally be better off. And there are genetic modifications in animals that make them better off. For example, disease resistance for Marek's disease in chickens, which was done by USDA some years ago. To me, the most profound moral issue, and I've written 6 papers on this and presented all over the world on it, is occasioned by genetic engineering for biomedical research. Through genetic engineering of animals, one can create so-called animal models for human genetic diseases that do not occur naturally in animals and render them susceptible to study. The problem is that many, if not most, genetic diseases in humans involve a great deal of suffering. If you want to test your religious belief, take a look at the standard textbook of genetic diseases called the Metabolic Basis of Inherited Disease. That, I'm sure you've looked at that, comprises over 3,000 pages of tight column print. And it's really nightmare stuff. I mean, there's no horror movie as horrifying as some of these genetic diseases. In most cases, the suffering attendant on these diseases cannot be controlled in humans. A fortiori, they won't be controlled in experimental so-called mouse models. Given that such animals will surely be developed as quickly as technology allows, how can we assure that the animals created do not live lives of constant pain, suffering, and distress? That's my reason I think that the general public in Gaskell's experiment rejected the creation of animal models. And I've written about this regarding a particular genetic disease you probably never heard of, called Lesch-Nyhan syndrome. Have you heard it? It's a mistake in xanthine metabolism, not that far removed actually from gout. But this is a much more horrendous disease because children who have the genetics for this disease will show mental retardation, they'll show spasticity, and the worst thing, I can't see Barbara. Well, okay, thank you. I mean, I always tell my audiences, if I go over, I've traveled 2,000 miles to get here as part of a 4-stop trip, yes. You're going to have to take me off physically. and I can bench 500 pounds, so I'll just tell you that. The Lesch-Nyhan syndrome people have a tendency to self-mutilate. That's inexorable. The few of them that are verbal will beg you to put their arms under restraints. They will stick their fingers in electric fans, in the spokes of a wheelchair, and most horrendously, they'll bite their fingers and lips off. In the standard textbook, it says this can only be controlled by extraction of teeth. And I was very worried in 1986 about the creation of animal models for that disease. And I even bet that that would be one of the first ones created, and it was. But for reasons that are still unclear, it did not manifest itself phenotypically. Some promoter or something was missing. So that worries me. And there's a related problem. If you look at the federal laws that the doctor mentioned for controlling pain and suffering, the nucleus of those laws is the production of protocols anticipating what the animals may suffer. I do a fracture protocol. I'll use oxymorphone to control the pain, whatever. In genetic research, things like knockout genes, ablation, insertion, modification, are unpredictable inherently, right? That's why we do it. And you cannot write down on your protocol the anticipated negative consequences because you don't know what they are. This was called to my attention by a guy at the University of Washington who said, we have a program with 12 lab animal veterinarians in training. We can send them all around the campus where they're doing transgenic work. We have 2 lab animal veterinarians at CSU. They can't possibly visit every lab. So it breaks the system. It breaks the system that the doctor was praising. And I confess, when we wrote the system, we didn't anticipate this kind of research. And so in sum, although the issue of animal welfare has been virtually ignored, that raises much more profound ethical issues than the pseudo-issues that have seized headlines and must be the subject of massive public attention. Economic and medical progress should not be achieved at the expense of limitless suffering on innocent animals. Thank you for listening.
I think I'll see if I can Come on, Bernie.
Big woman. Can I take some questions?
Yeah. Well, it's at the end. It's at the end.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Well, that was a fascinating presentation, and we have next Professor Margaret Foster Riley, who has the distinction of teaching in two of the schools at the university, the one university founded by Thomas Jefferson, the University of Virginia. She teaches public health law and bioethics at the University of Virginia Law School, and she also teaches as an associate professor at the University of Virginia Medical School. Amongst some of the things that she has recently published include the article Regulating Reproductive Genetics, a review of American bioethics commissions, and a comparison to the British Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, which does an excellent job of offering a comparative analysis of American versus British and other models for handling these important issues. Without further ado, Margaret Foster Riley.
Thank you. I couldn't mic myself, so I'm stuck with this. I have to show you the one of the major differences between philosophers and law professors who do bioethics is law professors already have to do PowerPoint. We're stuck with it. Philosophers can actually talk. So I do want to thank everyone involved in this conference. I actually went to Duke as an undergrad, and yesterday I got to go to gross chemistry and visit the auditorium where I took organic chemistry, which is what convinced me to go to law school. And I've never. You are going to get a lawyer's perspective of bioethics as we go through this. And one thing Bernie and I absolutely agree on, but may not be clear, I do want to, before I even start, talk about what we're talking about when we say ethics. And we're not talking about personal morality at this point. We're not talking about religion. We're not even talking about cultural morality. We're actually talking about ethics as a process. And I really want to emphasize that last word, process, because ethics is not something you can just see automatically. It's something you have to study and analyze. So let's start. Hey, it works. Actually, in some ways, where Bernie left off. Why does the public not trust biotechnology? And I think there are actually a lot of things at play in here. And I'm actually going to hit on probably every one of us in the room, and even probably the hardest on the ones who are underrepresented. But I think as this has become more and more a commercial enterprise, you do see a great deal of hype with biotechnology. And in fact, there's actually a reverse effect of that. When the hype isn't realized, people get mad and you have a rejection of the technology. We all know these, some very well-publicized scandals involving most of them not in this country, but some in this country. This one I'm going to show you some slides on. They're some of my favorites, and Bernie certainly hit on this. There are some major media transgressions with this, and as a result, there is a lot of confusion in the public. Bernie hit on this, certainly a failure of scientists to acknowledge that science is value-laden or address public fears. I would actually say that this is a growing process. In the 70s, this was absolutely the view of scientists. I think that has changed. You're going to see influxes, but I would also say that it could change a lot more. This one is not actually very often pointed out, and I'm going to hit hard on myself and my own profession as a bioethicist and tell you that there has been a very major failure of ethicists to engage both the public and the scientific world, and we can't blame them and not blame ourselves. And this is something I'd like to explore further. And then when you add all of that up, you end up with, is the public wrong? All of us who are engaged in this process have to actually show why the public should have a different view. I think we can. I actually think conferences like this are a start on that. So let's see if I can do it. Yes. this is how the public thinks of chimeras and genetic transfers. In fact, I see this, I'll have a reporter talk to me about the science is sort of frightening, but discuss the science with me, and then this is essentially what the article looks like. I clearly am not doing a good enough job of making it clearer. This is actually one of my all-time favorite slides. This is what a slide that came out after human neurocells were implanted in actually mice. But if you look at it, this is the end run. We have this atom bomb will be fantastic. And these are inflammatory. And this makes us have a different view of what biotechnology can and should be. And we have to understand what that's doing. And we also have to understand when we're doing it ourselves. We often do because we want to get our points through. This is unfortunately what happens when we do that. I have frequently had, as you know, sitting here as an ethicist, but we could put a scientist there too. And when you give them the facts, that's what you get. And it doesn't get in the newspaper, and no one does anything with it. So on to more prosaic things. I want to look at some ethical points here. Many of you may be familiar with Leon Kass's work on yuck. It is actually exactly what he calls it, the yuck response. And I actually disagree quite fundamentally with Kass that that is an ethical response. I think yuck is an emotional response. But I also think that we ignore a little bit of this, the cool, which is what we who are engaged in this area often will think of when we look at the technology, and we go, cool. Both of these are emotional responses to the science, and with cool, we actually throttle forward without thinking too much. With yuck, we want to get bans and moratoria, and we go backwards, but they're actually two sides of the same coin. And what they ultimately should be to us is it's time to start thinking about what ethical considerations need to come in here. Oops, wrong thing here. Now, a few of you, especially those of you who are law professors in here, will start seeing this terrible word, which I actually didn't want to use because when I use that, that means people go to sleep. But it's very interesting. My colleagues in the law and economics side, when they suddenly discovered about 10 years ago that the reason they weren't actually having an ability to predict behavior was because people didn't actually act rationally, have studied quite considerably the psychological heuristics that are involved in dealing with some of these ethical dilemmas, or at least, in a sense, the emotional dilemmas that first come up. And as Bernie mentioned, there's actually, George Gaskell's involved in this, but this is a very rich field. It starts with Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. And I'm just going to give you two of them that show us how we get different results and what's going on here. When lay people confront situations where they don't feel in control, my analogy to this is often for people getting on airplanes. They don't feel in control. And they have this response, so they perceive risks in the context of catastrophic potential and threat to future generations. And this is one tiny place I'll disagree with Bernie in the sense I won't actually split out the ethics response here, because I actually think when they're seeing a threat to future generations, sometimes they're over-perceiving the threat to our moral fabric of society. And so you do get this, and it repeats itself every time. Now, it is an aggregate. I'm not going to say every individual feels this way. On the contrast side, you often will get this, where scientists overestimate their ability to control unforeseen circumstances. So if these are two heuristics directly in contradiction with each other ultimately, what that actually says is we have to get together and figure it out. And try. We shouldn't be based on how we feel about it making policy. We should instead be working through together what the end result should be. Now, I want to actually exclude a few things before I go on. I actually think it's very important for us to think about what we're doing when we talk about ethics. We need to distinguish between ethical problems and religious or political problems. And I'm using the stem cell debate here because it's actually something we're not talking about, so it actually allows us to look at it more in the abstract. But if you look at what's going on in conference after conference after conference with stem cell, I usually see Art Kaplan has a slide, why hasn't ethics kept up with science? And frankly, it's not ethics what's going on there. That's politics. The people involved actually, I hope, have actually done their own ethical considerations, but at that point they have made their decision, and really what's going on is politics, not ethics. They're not talking to each other anymore. They may talk at the same conference, but they're not talking to each other. We need to be aware of that here. We are all, I do it sometimes, and I'm even worse than most of you because I'm trained in ethics, so I can make my political statement look like an ethical statement. But you really need to watch that because you need to say, am I listening or am I actually engaged in politics here? These are things I don't think we can resolve, but I'd like them to be in the background because these are very interesting societal issues. I think that natural has become a good in itself, and we don't actually think, what does natural mean? Is it really good? Or Mother Nature in the 19th, 18th century was viewed as horrible and mean and, you know, claws and teeth. Or has it become a proxy for something else here? I don't know the answer to that. That's a major ethical discussion, one we should have, but I'm trying to be very practical here, so we're not going to go into that debate. I do actually want to point out that I think that Bernie said that the heart was the repository of the soul. I think for our modern society that DNA has become the repository for the soul for much of the public. And as a result, people think you can't touch it. And we need to explore what we've done. And I'll actually say it's people like me and scientists who have actually done that because a lot of the hype going with the Human Genome Project has created that situation. And it's our job to undo it. Things we do need to address now. And I think we're starting to in this room, and it's a major debate going on, and I actually don't want to say that this is not being discussed, but it needs to be discussed more broadly. What point is it, if we have some, how do we decide how much is too much? How do we decide whether it's acceptable to put human neural cells in animals' brains? This is going on with mice now. It's actually creating some wonderful science. The question is, what's it doing? And is it right? How does that affect us? How does it affect the mice? And all of these need to be considered. Bernie actually raised these. These are mostly consequential issues, and I'm not going to actually go through them in that much because Bernie and I agree that all of these are major issues. We might disagree with how you're going to deal with them and what the ethical outcome would be. But all of these, I think anyone looking at these problems needs to consider. Some of them may have real answers, and the real problem is if we're in our political framework rather than our ethical framework, we may not hear what the other side is telling us. We have to be careful when we're dealing in this area to actually, if we're going to provide examples of things, we should be providing empirical data showing what's going on and how it's progressing over time, not just sitting there saying this is a scary example, but how it's going on in the overall. Is it improving? Is it not improving? These are things I'd like to see. Okay, so we have ethical issues we can resolve. How should we do it? A few years ago, 2002, my colleague Jim Childress, who is in many senses one of the fathers of at least biomedical ethics, worked on this it was a Greenwald Foundation grant and actually worked with Bio on this. And it was designed more thinking of biotechnology, not just in animals, but in the large and often in terms of human medical things. But these are a couple slides I want you to look at. The only person in this room I know has seen these slides is Eddie Sullivan, because I actually worked with him on it. And that actually worries me, because what that means is this was important work, and we as ethicists didn't manage to convey it to the general public, to the scientific community, or anyone else. And so I want you to think about this as you think about what I'm doing when I'm doing ethics. So as I said, ethical analysis is a process. Good ethical analysis requires practice. You can't just think you're good at it immediately. You actually have to learn how to do some of it. Ethical analysis is best practiced in a group. Personally, probably my husband would prefer that you all hire me and pay me lots of money singly to come and solve your ethical dilemmas. But I have to tell you, you'd probably be better off if you had me and Bernie, and maybe even someone like Holmes Ralston, who disagrees with us completely, get together and wrestle with the problems, because we're going to bring different frames to the problems and actually make it so you can understand it better. And ethical analysis involves imagination. And if we're in our political head, our imagination's gone. And this is one approach. Those of you who know Childress's work see this as an extension of Childress's work. But I think this is crucial as we're looking at this, because we have to look at many issues when we're dealing with this. Bernie focused a great deal on animal welfare, and I actually do think that animals are part of the critical stakeholders. And on the biomedical side, frankly, we've often forgotten the critical stakeholders of the animals. Having said that, I think sometimes on the animal side, we forget that some of the critical stakeholders are people, and that this research is being done for good reasons, but we could do it better by looking at all the critical stakeholders and understanding the different things going on here. So I think this is a process, and if you actually realize that you take step by step and work that through together in a group, you get interesting answers. I cannot promise you get results. I can't promise you have the right solution. Sometimes you run into that sort of Hegelian mess where you have two good solutions that are in direct conflict with each other. And that is a tragedy. And I don't know what to do in those situations, except we've got to wrestle through it. And I think with this animal biotechnology, we're often in that kind of situation. This goes along, again, you're going to see really Jim Childress here, do no harm, produce benefits. Produce a net balance of benefits over harms. Again, if we're considering all the stakeholders, we come in with this situation. One that I do want to bring in here, because I actually think we play this role here with when we're in our political mode rather than our ethical mode, we do play a role on deceiving on both sides. And again, I can do it really well. I'm not only an ethicist, I'm a lawyer. So this is probably a place where Bernie and I would disagree, and it's sort of, in a sense, counterintuitive. When people see ethical problems that they want to resolve, often the first thing they say is there ought to be a law. And you saw that actually, this you wouldn't disagree with, cloning, for example. The moment Dolly was born, I can't think of how many pieces of legislation, both at the federal side and state side, came out against all sorts of cloning. Some of them were actually pretty amusing, and in Virginia they actually ended up banning sexual reproduction between humans, which was pretty interesting. But I think you need to be very careful of this bans and moratoria. This is usually done in what I would call moral panic. And it does not work with science very much. There may be a few things, but frankly, I can't even think of many off the top of my head that really warrant bans and moratoria. And I actually put moratoria up there because people always feel better when they say, well, we're just going to have a moratorium. But a lot of times, if you have a legislative moratorium, you might as well have a ban. It's the same thing. Law is a very blunt instrument, and this goes into some of yesterday's conversation. Law does not deal well with shades of gray. That's done better at a different place. There are places that the law has been quite successful. We've been hammering at the Animal Welfare Act, but I have to tell you, as someone who does a fair amount of work on the human side, I often wish we had the same regulations on the human side to protect humans that we have on the animal side. A couple other things I'll actually say, this is a place where we are ripe for some legislative change. And I actually think it's important for you to realize that in my experience, most of the people doing animal biotechnology would not fight a lot of those. They actually, in their own businesses, are trying to promote animal welfare and would seek guidance on that. So let's not look at each other as all enemies in this, and instead try and figure out a way around that and how it could work together. Whoops, wrong thing. Now, I'm a lawyer, so I can't help tell you a little bit of law and ethics together. We have to realize that also when we deal with law, we're not dealing with law simply in a vacuum. Whenever you try and legislate, you are actually affecting existing laws. And much of what we do is dictated right here by the coordinated framework that said biotechnology is not inherently risky and that we're going to give it under the jurisdiction of FDA, EPA, USDA. I'm not going to go through that. We went through that yesterday. I don't have to review it too much. But realize that has an effect on when you want to legislate ethics, that actually has an effect on what you can and can't do, at least at the federal level. This often gets lost, but much U.S. regulation focuses on product rather than process. That has ethical implications. It often means that you're not looking at things until you get to the product stage. So you may want to be looking at things ahead of time. FDA, we won't go through this, but there are times where FDA has tried to regulate process, and at that point it's on statutorily shaky ground, and it needs to, it usually won't succeed in that. Other than I mentioned this, that other than the AWA, you often have nothing until it's pretty far along in the development process. Social moral value may not be assessed. Economic value may be limited to marketability. And the main focus is going to be on whether the product is generally recognized as safe. Now, I have to tell you something. Frankly, I'm not uncomfortable with that being what FDA's main focus is, or frankly, APHIS's main focus on a lot of these things, because they don't have enough money to do that well. So I'd like them to do that well, and if we're going to do this other stuff, think about a different forum for it. I'm going to say just a few things about labeling requirements. The only tiny little thing I'll say about when we discuss the RBST, this all gets pretty inflamed the way we look at it. But FDA's decision was not it's often viewed as immoral that FDA didn't label RBST, but that was actually a legal decision. It has nothing to do with morality. So we could argue about whether it should be, and I'm about to drop a little bomb here and make you think about that. But let's take that apart. FDA cannot label for that sort of thing. But I think we all need to look very hard at what we're doing with labeling. I often find labeling is used as an end run. When we couldn't achieve things through other means, we actually decide we're going to deal with that with labeling. And there is a perception in this society that if we disclose or we give people information, basic information, that that's good and that's all we need to do. But a label with 5 words on it is not giving someone information. When we deal with labeling, I'd just like us to think about, and this is on all sides of the fence here, that if we think as a lawyer, our main client is the consumer. And therefore, ethically, we should be considering how that consumer is going to react to a label. It shouldn't be done to just serve our own purposes. I mentioned this already. This is one of the major areas we've talked about here. And as I also said, I think that you should not automatically assume that people you perceive as being on the other side of the fence aren't working with you. Most people involved in biotechnology care very much about meeting these requirements, and actually, frankly, care more about meeting more than the requirements. Most, and this is actually through education that they're going to have to get there, want to look at many of the considerations Bernie said. Don't assume bad intent. What you really should look at is, are they thinking about it? And if you do ask them to think about it, I think you're going to find action. So, APHIS still hasn't really done anything with this. I check the website every 3 months to see whether they have done anything with it. I don't think there are many APHIS representatives here. I think they purposely aren't here because they don't want to hear about that. This is a major point I want to have for us to think about. I've mentioned the FDA and USDA are strapped. Ethics is always going to take a back seat. Also, if you start passing laws, you should be able to enforce a law. They don't have any enforcement money or authority in many cases. Remember, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Many people in this room probably got pretty upset with the whole Plan B fiasco when ethics was inserted into FDA's review. It may not be the ethics you want. And don't forget, USDA has a dual mission here. USDA is not just there to oversee agriculture, it is there to promote agriculture. And it doesn't take ethical training to see a conflict of interest right there. Whoops, I went too fast. Patent law, I'm not going to go through too much. I'm going to actually say one thing that's not considered enough with patent law. We know that in this country it doesn't have a moral point of view. And actually with that, I'm actually going to also tell you that the last place I want ethics to be reviewed is at the USPTO. They can't even get through the applications that they have. And I do want to think, though, of using patent law as an engine for ethical expansion. And here, really, I'm just thinking creatively. But Hatch-Waxman and pediatric research with an expansion of exclusivity actually were ethical moves as a way of, through patent law, encouraging some sort of ethical in the pediatric research case, looking at more pediatric cases. And there may be a creative way to think about patent law. Big problems with legislating ethics. If you look at civil rights, you see very vividly that law follows culture. Law does not create culture. It can be a partner as you get to a certain place, but unless you've done the ethical work beforehand, you will not actually do much with changing law. Law, I fight this one. I think ethics does a good job keeping up with science, at least if the dialogue is occurring, but law can't. If you've ever gotten involved in legislation, you know what fun it is to get it through any legislature. And as I said, law is black and white, has trouble dealing with shades of gray. This is perhaps one of the most important things to remember. Biotechnology is global. If we start getting into a situation where we start going after each other, what we're actually going to find is we will drive it offshore. And in terms of the biotechnology we're discussing now, it's everywhere. Last week I was looking at an agreement between Morocco and Brazil on animal cloning. If you think that you can legislate some of these ethical issues away, you can do it in a state, you might be able to do it in this country, but you actually have to change the culture at a transnational level. You cannot think that you're going to be able to do it just here. One place, actually, I saw this occur, China, incidentally, which doesn't have an Animal Welfare Act, that actually failed to get through. But because of the various cloning rules in most of the developed world, China actually was, because it felt ethical pressure, did adopt its own cloning regulations. And that's the kind of thing I think you want to look for. So if not law, or just some law, what should we do? Well, I'm a fan of these largely because I could then employ lots of my students. But I would also tell you that I think these serve a big purpose, and I've worked with some companies on creating these. But the problem is they're underused and they're frequently window dressing. They can be a way to address ethical issues that aren't even within IRB or IACUC review. And I think if these were developed more fully, they could really be a useful place for some of this dialogue. They have to be done in such a way where they're not packed just with the people who are coming out with the result that's looked for. I advocate community members and community members who are real community members. And I think what you actually will find is that companies that realize they're creating products are very happy to do that because they want that input as they're working it through. The problem with any committee, I sit on our IRB for the medical science, is you have this problem where the regulation gets so nitpicky and absurd that actually, to be honest with you, the ethics gets lost, and it creates this sort of us versus them mentality. I'd like to try and figure out a way of getting rid of that. Industry ethics organizations are crucial because they're often made up of both scientists and members of the industry, but there are problems with them. Frankly, I've spoken at a bunch of like Virginia Bio, and 5 people come to my brilliant talk, while there are about 500 people in the marketing talk. So I think we need to, and again, that may be my fault. My talk may not be as brilliant as I think. But somehow we've got to make this a bigger piece of what's going on. And the obvious problem here is that bioindustry is not really democratic. It's made up of the members of bio. So I think that has to be the starting point, but we need something that's larger than just bio or any industry group. Now, this was actually done because we were trying to get legal ethics credits, but I found I fell in love with it. So when we didn't get the legal ethics credits, it worked. I think there's a lot we can learn in this area from the legal profession. Everyone hates lawyers. I used to have a slide about how everyone hated lawyers. But one thing law has learned, and if you actually think about it, all of us who are lawyers in this room, yes, there are ethical scandals in law and things, but remarkably few when you consider what we're dealing with. And the legal profession's relative autonomy carries with it this important role of self-government. And it has a very complex web of ethical standards. It doesn't go into looking at the morality of lawyers. Perhaps falsely, we actually assume that anyone who's admitted to the bar is a moral person. So we're not attacking personal morality. What we're saying is this is so complex, you haven't been taught enough to deal with it, and your own personal morality, while it shouldn't be left at the back door, should be not the only thing we're going to look at. Don't assume ethics is easy. It requires education, and ethics is not, and I've been told this by plenty of people, it is not a matter of opinion. It's a process. It's something you have to develop. This is what my students look like when they're told they have to take legal ethics. Not when Kathy Bradley teaches it here at Duke. So people don't want this. Let's be honest. Do we, as lawyers, like it when we have to get CLE ethics credits? We think, oh, God. But the reality is, I think most of us who are lawyers in this room are very thankful we've had it. I've been confronted with many ethical problems in my practicing career, and thank goodness I had it because I could never have made the decisions on the fly. So I think that's what we need to be looking for here. I would like to see national ethics review, but I don't want to see what we have going now, unfortunately. As you mentioned, I wrote a major piece on looking at bioethics commissions, and frankly, in the very beginning, they were pretty neat. They aren't really very neat now. How many of you actually read the President's Council on Bioethics reports? About 5 of us in this room, 10 at most. I do, but The public sure does. I know the public doesn't even know it exists. So we've got to figure out something more that's going on. This is where I think we as ethicists have failed. I loved the RAC, the Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee, when it was first conceived right after or during Asilomar. It was immediately a subject to all sorts of jurisdictional battles and became a shell of itself. I'd like to go back to something like the RAC. In a perfect world, what I'd like to see is a dynamic, a national board here that's independent, that provides multiple voices. I don't know that this will accomplish, but I'm giving you my perfect world. I want local bodies because you can't do it just at the national level. You have to do it at the local level. I'd like to see interplay between the two of them. I think that conferences like this are a first start towards that. I think they're bigger issues than animal biotechnology. Synthetic biology, you want to talk about scary and ethical issues? Forget this conference. That needs to be in there too. Nanotechnology seems very engineering, so it's not scary. It's pretty scary. We need to be opening this dialogue, larger than animal biotechnology, but it needs to be going on. So my only last message is ethics should be part of all of us, and we should not be thinking of it as something that's having our mother tell us what to do, but as something working together, we actually come out with a good result. Thank you.
Suggested that book.
Oh, I know. I think we need it. No, it's hard. No, they're so political.
I know.
Dr. Rollins, considering science-based regulation being developed or existing in the United States, and that no GE animal, genetically engineered animal, has been approved after 10 to 15 years of development, the first question to ask, are your arguments about moving too fast really relevant to this group today?
David, because it's taped, it might be good to get them up there.
Do these not work? These work.
Okay.
No transgenic animals have been approved?
That's what the question states.
That's false. The onco mouse?
True.
The onco mouse? The transgenic oyster? Well, it's commercialized. Maybe it's not approved. I don't know what approved means in this context, but I was at DuPont in the 80s when they got the onco mouse that they had helped develop at Harvard. That's the mouse that's subject to mammary tumors and is used to study breast cancer. Oh, sorry. Yeah. And, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's too fast or too slow. I wasn't making that point about our society. I was saying that circumspection in release and deployment of these animals is essential, and that it takes some time. And I don't mean red tape time, and I don't mean bureaucracy time. The federal government is very good, as Mimi suggested, at spinning lots of paper and lots of talk that looks like ethics but actually has nothing to do with ethics, right?
Not just the federal government.
Right, but they're the big player.
For Professor Riley, how can you do no harm? Here we have the old primum non nocere question coming up. How can you do no harm when you are balancing benefits versus harm? The latter accepts that some harm, that is to animals, will inevitably occur. So.
I think do no harm is one principle, as I had there, and actually if you look at the biomedical principles, one of 4, we do harm. We do harm all the time to humans when we're doing clinical research, not just animals. So I think do no harm, if you look at it as an entire, an absolute, impossible to get around. The question is, how do we do no harm that we went through this yesterday with Professor Reppy, but, justifiable, I'm not going to get into a semantic battle on this. But when we look at do no harm, we're not doing harm that doesn't get us somewhere and various other permutations of that, in conjunction with the other principles that I had there. Now, I could get into a whole philosophical discussion with you about Kantian ethics versus consequential ethics and tell you that under Kantian ethics there are certain harms we cannot do. I don't think I have time to do that right now. There are harms that we should not do. I, at least, have decided for myself in ethical consultation with others is that some harm for animals or some harm for people is justifiable in certain contexts. And that's about as far as I can take it.
All right. Next one for Professor Rollin. You differentiate intrinsically wrong, quote unquote, from, quote, dangerous to society, quote unquote. But the only examples that you give of intrinsically wrong actions are spurious ethical claims. Are you downplaying that?
I don't believe in intrinsic. I have a lot of trouble with that whole intrinsic wrong and intrinsic right. I'm not sure I know what that means. I have trouble with the concept of intrinsic value. The way I've defined it in my writings is there's intrinsic value in things that are conscious because what you do to them matters to them. I can make no sense, and Professor Riley and I were talking about this last night, make no sense at all of the environmentalist claim that rocks and wilderness areas have intrinsic value. So, yes, I'm downplaying it.
So, just to see how far you're downplaying it, does that mean that aside from actual animal suffering, something that can be measured and documented, you find no intrinsic harms in the animal's context?
In the what, sorry?
In the context of the intrinsic harms that you were discussing?
Yeah, I mean, if you go beyond harming the individual, I don't really think you can harm a species or harm a wilderness area except in a metaphorical way. And if you do, there are reasons why that, suppose you annihilate a species. That's not bad to the species. It's bad to other human beings. It's bad to the ecosystem. It's bad, bad, bad. But I mean, you don't abuse a species. Whereas my colleague Holmes Rolston says, with the specter of God behind all his writing, that if you destroy a species, you destroy a super individual because it was created by God. And I don't think in those terms, and I don't think we ought to think in those terms societally. That makes sense?
Makes sense.
Okay.
For Professor Riley, you describe ethics as a, quote, process, unquote. When do issues involved in bad medicine, in biomedicine, biotechnology, let's not...
Freudian slip there.
Well, Freudian slip, yes, or at least a girdle, But when do issues involved in biomedicine, biotechnology become rules of ethics, like rules of ethics in the legal profession, so that the debate has certain expectations and realistic standards? I would say like debates about disciplinary rules, say, versus mere ethical considerations.
I think things like the slides I put up on the principles that we consider are a first start on that. To be perfectly honest, we're nowhere near in biomedicine or bioethics where the legal profession took it. The legal profession's actually done this largely by looking at cases over several centuries and trying to balance things, and as a result we actually have been able to form rules which say when you are confronted by this situation through considerable trial and error, we have figured out that this is the rule that best deals with all the ethical issues that are involved there. I don't think we're there. We've actually, this is an amazingly new, if you want to call it a science, new science. No one talked about ethics until the 70s. a little bit from the Nuremberg trial, so I shouldn't say no one talked about it, but it was really quite remarkable. If you look at what was going on in medicine and everywhere else, after the Nuremberg trials, you really didn't see people realizing the relevance of ethics. It came in full force in the 70s. So we have 175 minimum years of catch-up to be done. I'd like to see if you had something like that national body I was talking about, or you even had many local ethics groups that could get together periodically and describe their situations, you could start getting a body that would look a little bit more like legal ethics.
Let's just follow up on that for a moment. For example, we've had several hundred years of evolving discussions about legal ethics, and yet we've seen the issue of lawyer advertising and solicitation of clients remain controversial for the past 100 years and result in 5-4 decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court. And yet we have the American Bar Association and other bodies that discuss, debate, and analyze these issues, and sometimes lobby. What sort of national forum, if it were, or transnational forum, as you suggested, Professor Riley, would you think could actually be put together in a practical sense to advance the discussion and analysis of these issues on a national level?
I should first point out a couple things. One is, with any law or regulation, culture will change the import of that law or regulation. So when we see advertising rules changing in the law, clearly culture's changing and we're looking at things in new ways. Nothing's static. In terms of applying that to a national body, I actually have to tell you that I am not so naive to necessarily think my dreams will completely come true. I've studied commissions a little too hard to believe that the political pressures that are involved in this will get me to my goal. But I want to be aspirational because I think that's where we are in this meeting here. A national body, actually, I think, what I'd love to see, actually, is you have a national body that discusses these things, that allows a forum. You have bio playing some of the role the ABA plays. You have other advocacy, NGOs playing other roles that would play within that. And it really is, for me, a way of making this so it's a public dialogue. Will it get to the point that legal ethics is? Frankly, we don't license scientists yet. I don't think we're going to be in a situation where we have a monopoly and we're going to get to the same place. But I think there's a lot they can learn from each other.
Then, with respect to both of you, how is it that we can actually move to a point where there can be a more reasoned discussion of the bioengineering ethical issues with respect to animals and in a broader context, so that we have input from different sources, and it's not just Michael Crichton's most recent best-selling novel about nanotechnology or bioengineering that determines the framework of discussion? How do we actually arrive at such a point?
Well, I mean, there are multiple avenues. The lab animal issue, when I confronted it in the 70s for the first time with our group who began to write legislation, was trench warfare. You had the scientific community in the form of their representatives, like Neighbor, lobbying mortar fire at entrenched animal activists, saying things like, and this is true, I can demonstrate this, that if science is in any way restricted, we won't cure your children. And on the other hand, you had the activists lobbying mortars saying everything we have achieved in science could have been done without animals. And what we did, which is actually amazing that nobody had done it before, was go to the middle. We went to the middle and we created these local committees because, you know, having studied the Talmud at one point in my life where I'd rather forget it, but I was influenced by the fact that the Judaic tradition tried to make rules for everything, and the Talmud is the debates about those rules that never end. So instead, we made very general rules like you have to control pain and distress, and then expected them to be worked out on a local level through the animal care and use committees. And they have been. And I do lectures on this, I do whole days on it, on the way in which ethical thought evolves in that context. All you have to do is give them a frame in which to discuss. Can I just make one emendation to what the doctor said? The Animal Welfare Act does not cover mice. That's one of the glaring omissions. But the NIH rules, which also became law in '85, do cover all vertebrate animals. And many institutions, illustrating my point about ethical progress, apply those rules to invertebrates where there's reason to believe that what we do to them matters to them. I'm very happy with that system, and I agree with Dr. Riley completely. We maybe should set some national framework and let people work it out themselves. That's what we do. That's democracy.
I'd like to thank both of these panelists for elevating the discussion and bringing a reason to the fore of some very important and controversial issues. Thank you very much for your time.
10-minute break. Come back in 10 minutes.